Thanks, Sean. I'll start off a little bit just talking about FEE and what we do. It is FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education. We are an organization in some ways, and not entirely in all ways, similar to the Institute for Liberal Studies, Matt's organization. We provide educational seminars for high school and college students across the globe. We publish our magazine, The Freeman, which I hope if you haven't grabbed it, you grab it before you leave today. We also publish a number of other kind of short booklets and monographs, things like Great Myths of the Great Depression, please take that, and a number of other books. There's a bunch of other stuff here that you can take before you go today. One of the things I want to mention is this summer, as we do every summer for the last 50 years, is we conduct, this year it's going to be 10 summer seminars. They're 3-day events. All of our locations this year are in the United States. There are 3-day opportunities to learn and interact with the ideas of classical liberalism, as Matt and John were explaining. It's with different faculty, different speakers. It's very much an educational opportunity, but it's also an opportunity to network, to meet people that are also interested in these ideas. And we also talk about career opportunities, other networking opportunities, and wherever you happen to live. So I encourage all of you to check out our website, fee.org, and check it out. These seminars are absolutely free to you. Once you get there, you don't pay tuition, you don't pay for your food, you don't pay for your hotel room. We take care of all of that. So it's an opportunity for you to take a trip basically to the United States almost for free. And it can be completely for free, maybe. There are people out there who are interested in funding students to travel to these events. And I encourage you to talk to Matt about that. He kind of has the hookup for that, so for Canadian students. So definitely get in touch with him about that. Just one short note. I do have a little bit of a cough, so I'm going to be eating cough drops the entire thing. So sorry about that, but it's better than actually listening to the cough. I'm here today to talk about trade and what trade means. And the reason I'm semi-competent to talk about this is because before I was the executive director of FEE, I worked for 7 years at the U.S. Department of Commerce as a trade negotiator and as a trade facilitator, specifically between the United States and countries in the Middle East. So I got to travel to places like Morocco and Egypt and Israel and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Oman and pretty much every country in the Middle East to facilitate foreign companies, American companies and their attempts to get inside those markets. And then if we have free trade agreements or other agreements with them, I would be part of the negotiating teams to make those happen. I left after 7 years, almost 7 years, and I'll get a little bit into this as we go along. But I left that because I started to realize that what we were creating was not so much free trade, but actually managed trade. We were creating a condition where people who were generally free to interact with each other all of a sudden had to interact with each other in the context of these giant free trade agreements. And I don't know, from NAFTA to any other agreement that Canada or the United States has, most of these documents are thousands of pages long. And they're basically a lawyer's field day. And so I realized that what I was creating was not what I was hoping I was creating. I was hoping I was creating more free trade, more opportunities for people to deal with each other in a peaceful, commercial manner. And I realized I wasn't doing that. So over the course of those 7 years, I started getting more and more interested in the ideas of classical liberalism and then free trade. And I started reading different people like Hayek, like Ludwig von Mises, and looking at websites like the FEE website and other places to learn more about these ideas. And eventually, I quit that job, got my master's in economics, and then eventually made my way to FEE. Excuse me. So I'm going to make basically two arguments tonight. I'm going to make an argument to you about why I think trade is important and why it's more important than I than you probably think it is, and how integral it is to economic growth and what we're trying to achieve as a society. In terms of, we all want to get better, we want to have generally more stuff and be able to live more comfortably. That's generally been one of our goals as human beings from the very beginning, and how we achieve that through trade. And I'm also going to make an argument later on to show you that, by and large, and I'll be a little bit, I'll equivocate a little bit on this, but generally I think that's getting tougher rather than getting easier. Although we've accomplished a lot, it is getting tougher, I think. So if you bear with me, we'll dive into those couple things, and you'll see by the end what I mean by getting tougher. So I'm shocked at how much trade is not an issue generally in politics right now, at least in the United States. I can't really say in terms of Canada, but in the United States, in the presidential debates that are going on right now, it's basically a non-issue. There was a little discussion a couple nights ago at the debate, but it was basically just each candidate trying to zing each other about who's more in bed with the Chinese and stuff like that. It didn't really solve anything. It didn't really address anything. The reason I think that's a shame is because I think people's concept of what trade is and how it's conducted is totally warped in the media and in a lot of cases in even classrooms. So, and the one myth I want to dispel is that when you read something in a newspaper or in a journal article or anywhere that says China has a trade surplus with this, or China sold this many things to the United States or this many things to Canada, I want you to question that, because China doesn't trade. Last I checked, countries don't make transactions, with a few exceptions if you're a Defense Department or something like that. I'll grant you that. But for the most part, people make transactions. It's not that I don't have a trade deficit or surplus with anybody. I buy and sell what I want, for reasons that are on my own. I'm very skeptical, and I reject this notion that there are problems with the trade deficit, the trade surplus, and what China, the US, and Japan are doing to each other. And I'll give you a short example. I actually didn't talk about this last time, but I gave a similar talk. When an iPod is sold in the United States, or I should say enters the United States, it does come from China. And it registers as a $300 deficit to the US-China trade balance. Because that thing's worth generally $300. I'm rounding off here, but it's generally worth $300. That's rubbish. That's absolute rubbish, and you can read tons of papers about this. Just because it's worth $300 doesn't mean that $300 of that value came from China. As a matter of fact, our best estimate is that roughly about a nickel's worth of that value is contained within the Chinese value is contained within that iPod. Most of the money, when you pay your $300, again I'm rounding, for your iPod, most of that money through various channels is coming right back to Cupertino, California, and Apple, and some other folks for marketing and for transportation, most of which are American companies or North American companies. There's a couple of things that are involved with Japan and Korea, but the only thing they do in China is take a bunch of things that came from other places and put them together and screw the top on and hand it to the guy to put it in the box to send it to America. That's all that happens in China. The system is so screwed up that somehow means that the Chinese sold us $300 worth of stuff. Rubbish. Absolute rubbish. Don't listen to trade numbers. I can't emphasize this enough. Don't listen to them. They do not reflect reality in any way, shape, or form. And this is just not Carl like spouting off conspiracy theory. Go read the journal articles. Go read the papers that are on this. It's out there. Academia, the people that look at this, know this for a fact. It would be so hard. And the reason nobody changes it is, how do you do that? How would you measure that? How would you, it took people writing journal articles, years to backtrack all these parts and everything to find this stuff. There's no way any national bureaucracy can track this type of thing. So, general message, be skeptical of trade data. I'm skeptical, Trade is important for a couple reasons. Now getting back on track with my regular talk. And it's important for two reasons. One is the ethical component. And I don't think people realize this. Let's assume for a moment I'm Canadian, which I'm not. If I wanted to trade something with Matt, and I wanted to sell him this bottle of water, which is half empty, I don't know how you buy it, but, and he was willing to buy it, that would be a perfectly rational and reasonable trade, and we would exchange some money, or he would give me a stick of gum for it, or something. And everybody would be happy, and nobody would have anything to say about it. Everybody would be cool. But now, I'm an American. I carry a US passport, and Matt has something he wants to sell to me. That action, because nobody had looked at whatever he's trying to sell to me, look at what the tariff duty is, look at what the bureaucracy says about whether or not that thing can be sold to America because of some quota or something. That act, possibly, not in all cases, but possibly, with him selling me something would actually be illegal. I have a deep problem with that. We're both human beings. We're both, this kind of gets kind of flowery and hippy-dippy, but I want to make the point that we're both human beings. We both exist on this earth. We're both doing our thing, and we want to trade something, and somehow, all of a sudden, there's something in the way of that. I would like to make an argument that that's a human rights violation. That's a little bit harsher than I did yesterday, but I'd like to make the argument that that's a problem. Why is that? There should be a presumption of liberty. That's the phrase I like to use. A presumption of liberty that two people can go about a transaction in any way, shape, or form that they'd like, as long as they both agree to it and they're both gaining something from it. In the case of me and Matt, we could figure out a transaction to conduct, but somehow somebody else a third party's got to take a cut, or they got to stop it, or they got to put a quota on it, or something like that. That's a problem for me. And I'd like you to consider when you talk about trade, and when in your classes or wherever, think about what that means, and think about what's going on when you start passing laws and passing regulations that restrict two individuals from actually conducting some sort of action with each other. The second reason I think trade is important, that's not obvious or trivial, is because we all get better off from trade. In fact, it's the only way we get better off. It's the only reason there is economic growth, and it's the only reason there is advancement of culture and advancement of society towards us all being generally more comfortable. Let me explain what I mean. Trade happens because you have something that I don't. I want it, and I've made myself better off by making that exchange. I don't want this dollar in my pocket as much as I want the piece of gum I'm buying from you. So I do that. I'm better off, you want it, I got the gum, you got the dollar, everybody's happy. But, and that seems very trivial and kind of, yeah, so what? So it happens. I don't really care. But let's take an example, and I use this caveman example because I think it really puts in stark contrast what's actually happening there. So we're in a caveman society, and every day we all run out with our spears, and we go kill animals to eat, and that's how we survive. So we do that every day, and every day we kill about the same amount of animals. Some days we're lucky, some days we're not so lucky. We come back with less, and we just keep going on and on and on. And one day, one of the cavemen says, you know what, guys? I'm not going out today. I'm going to stay here. And I got a project I'm working on. Everybody's mad at him because he's not keeping up his end of the bargain. He's not working like everybody else. Everybody thinks he's just a slacker. But they go out anyway, and they just kind of forget about him. They come back that day, and they caught the same amount of animals, maybe a little less because he wasn't there. And he says, look, I got this thing. It's called a bow and arrow. And it's going to enable us to do more, better, more efficient hunting. We're going to get even more animals. We're not going to have to run around so much anymore. We're not going to burn a lot of calories. We're going to stand in one place, maybe hide up in a tree, shoot animals. We'll all be better off. And he says, but this is going to happen because I'm going to stay back here all the time. I'm going to make all these things. I'm going to make new arrows. I'm going to make new bows. I'm going to make better bows. And I'm going to trade you these bows and arrows in exchange for you giving me meat so I don't have to go out into the field. That's a trade. So what happened there? Yes, they traded meat for a bow and arrow, but what they also traded is a technological advancement. A technological advancement happened. This guy had leisure, essentially, where he was allowed to sit around in the cave, tinker with some things, fool around with some things, and enable a technological advancement that made everybody better off. But if he had to spend all day out in the field, shooting, throwing spears at things, then this would have never have happened, and nobody would be better off. There would be no technological advancement. Now they're getting more animals, they're getting more healthy, they're getting more nutrition, they're having more children, and maybe even somebody else can stay back. And what does he do? I don't know, he invents music, or he invents writing, or he figures out how fire works, or something like that. All those things happen because there's technological advancement, because people have this is Adam Smith's words, a propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. They have figured out that that's how you move forward. That's how trade is how you get that technological advancement and that societal advancement. That's really important. To the extent of the market exchanges enlarges, the more people that are able to do this makes us all richer, because they're able to spend more time. It's division of labor. It's the Adam Smith story. For those of you who don't know it, he talked about a pin factory, that one guy making pins and making 10 pins a day or whatever. But if you divide up that pin making process into 60 different processes and have just one guy working on that one process all day long, now you can make hundreds, thousands of pins. That's what's happening. And the fact that we can make more stuff means that that stuff gets cheaper. Essentially, in the caveman example, animals got cheaper because they didn't have to spend as much energy getting the same amount of animals. That's how we got richer. Trade enables that to happen. So that's my two non-obvious, non-trivial arguments for trade. Because a lot of people will say, well, why is trade good? Well, trade is good because it allows us to have different things and it's cultural exchange and blah, 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 blah. That's good. That stuff's all good, but it's not the fundamental reason why we trade. We trade because I would require somebody to give me a good reason to stop it from an ethical standpoint, and because it makes us richer. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about international trade, what's happened over the last 100 years or so, and where we are now, and what the kind of the prospects for the future are. And the end, I say kind of the title of this talk is Doll versus Action Figure. I get into kind of the silly and somewhat amusing ways that government is kind of preventing you from trading and how that impacts you. So the U.S. government, from Alexander Hamilton forward, and I talk a lot about the U.S. here, and I'd be interested in hearing for those of you that know, because I certainly don't know it, kind of what the Canadian experience is. So the U.S. government, from Alexander Hamilton forward, has always had a propensity to use trade and the tariff system as a means to an industrial policy, meaning they were basically it was protectionist. We have a small steel industry, or we have a small fishing industry, or a small shipbuilding industry. We're going to put tariffs, we're going to put barriers around those industries so that they can grow. That was the general U.S. system, thanks to Alexander Hamilton. And it was pretty, arguably you could say it was successful, although you could have arguments about that. You could certainly make the argument that things would have been better off without it, but that there's no counterfactual to prove that. In 1870, 44% of America's import value was taken as income by the U.S. Government. It's pretty huge. Anything that entered the United States, 44% of its value was going right back to the U.S. government. And that money represented 47% of the federal government total income. For the entire, end of the 18th century and the entire 19th century, basically the U.S. government lived off of trade. Of course, the U.S. government, except for the Civil War, wasn't really doing anything at that point. We were raising an army, we were doing the postal system, we were killing Native Americans. That was about it as far as the federal government was concerned. But despite all this, and despite that history, the general trend during that time globally was for freer trade and fewer tariffs. By 1913, an average tariff was down, U.S. average tariff was down to 17.6%. In 1913, there was a world of no passports. International trade was governed by private contracts mostly. It was a de facto gold standard with most countries linked to gold in some way or another. Movement of people, things, and capital was generally free, and possibly the most free it's ever been in history, although we can certainly argue that. What else happened in 1913 in the United States was that the income tax was passed by Congress, or actually by amendment, and the Federal Reserve was established. So this was a big shift, because what it did essentially is it said, the federal government's been living off trade for all these years. Now we're going to start living off something else. We're going to live off fiat money through the Fed, and we're going to live off the income tax. We're going to tax people domestically rather than tax what people buy from overseas. So there was a brief resurgence with World War I, and then the Great Depression, the Superhuman tariff. Nation states gradually reasserted control of trade, but it was not for income purposes, it was more for protectionist and fear reasons. And the global economy fell apart. In the United States, we had the Superhuman tariff. In the British Empire, and here in Canada, there was the Ottawa Conference, which happened, I want to say in 1929, I think it is 1929, which basically said, we're going to close off the Commonwealth to trade, except internally in most of the Commonwealth countries. So in 1930, the average tariff was up to 19%. But after World War II, the 1913 trend continued. 1946, 7.7%. 2010, 1.3%. Essentially, tariff-wise, trade is free. There's not a lot of tax, monetary tax, being put on trade at this point. And the reason for that is basically the global trade regime that I'll get to in a minute. Well, I'll talk a little bit about it now. You basically had a creation of a system, the General Agreements on Tariff and Trade, GATT, which in the late 90s morphed into the WTO. And this was a umbrella organization that's based in Geneva. And basically what it does is it's a talking shop although it's become more of a talking shop lately. But it started off as a talking shop where countries could get together and basically say, we believe in free trade, and here's how we're going to get there in a, yes, slow and bureaucratic fashion, but in a way that doesn't result in people ending up in trade wars and we end up with another smooth-hauling Great Depression situation. So basically, if you think about trade tariffs as some sort of block on trade with everybody's gun, if you will, on everybody else's head, saying, we got to lower these, but it's a way to bureaucratically kind of lower those guns all at once in a way that everybody's happy with, so nobody gets too upset or angry about the situation. That's one thing, and I think it was generally a good thing, especially before it switched from being the GATT to the WTO. Because the GATT had no power in and of itself. It was merely a talking shop, and it allowed countries to talk. So free trade reasserted itself, and why is that? We talked about the GATT, WTO, the rise of the income tax, a global realization in 1945 that when trade stops, armies start marching, essentially. That was the whole point of the EU. That's why the EU won the Nobel Peace Prize last week. It's kind of silly, but there is a kernel of truth there, because why was the EU started? The EU was started because smart people in Europe said, you know what, if we integrate these economies in a deliberate and in a deliberate way, we'll integrate them, people will become more used to each other, there won't be this, there will be a big cost to any kind of future mass European war. That was the general idea. Now the EU has morphed into something very much different since that original idea in 1945 and 46, but I think the original idea was a good idea. John Maynard Keynes, who was partial architect of the post-World War II economic structure through the Bretton Woods conferences and through all of it, including the WTO, well, the GATT at the time, and the World Bank and the IMF. We can argue about all those things, but and we can certainly argue about John Maynard Keynes, but one thing that he was very much pro-free trade. He talked a lot about, tax levels and printing more money and doing all kinds of things domestically. But internationally, he was a free trader, unequivocally. And so that's something we can be thankful to John Maynard Keynes for, because I don't think we would have free trade globally, a free trade society, without his pushing that. So of course we prefer, zero tariffs, zero trade highway at least. But in a political, bureaucratic world dominated by nation states, that's just not possible. So, and amazingly, in the post-World War II world, people like John Maynard Keynes and others found a way to get around that bureaucracy and establish a system, again, the WTO, to make all those things start to come down. So, like I said, 1.7% to 2010, we're done here, right? I mean, we have free trade, let's all go home. It's done. Unfortunately, that's not the case, because there are all kinds of tricks of the trade and crazy little things that bureaucracies, governments, the WTO, other organizations can do that aren't strictly tariffs. You can call them generally non-tariff barriers or technical barriers to trade, NTB, TBT, there's all kinds of acronyms. And I'm going to give you a few examples of these and how they impact you personally. Some of them are interesting, some of them are kind of silly, some of them are just kind of fun, but they are, I think they're legitimate problems, and I think there is a general trend for these things to keep growing. And so I would urge all of you to kind of keep your eye on them and kind of the future challenges to figure out how to deal with these things. Given that, I'm a pretty strong classical liberal, but I don't think the nation state is fading away anytime soon. So given that, I think these are things we got to keep our eye on. Intellectual property. In the United States, we have this bill, SOPA, which I have totally failed to remember what SOPA, Stop Online Piracy Act, thank you, I just remembered. Which was essentially a bill by the United States Congress that said, you know what, you can't put pirated materials on the web, you can't have all these online file sharing movies and music places. And if you do, the US government can basically shut you down. If you go to an ISP, an internet service provider, basically shut you down. The government has an on-off switch on the internet, essentially. That was the message of that bill. It was stopped. Thank God, in my opinion. But the WTO and other international organizations are talking about doing something similar via treaty. And kind of getting around nation states. Now, in the United States, we still have to pass it as a treaty and things like that, but I think that's a real concern, and it's something to watch. It's not imminent, it's not something that's going to happen anytime soon, but it's certainly being discussed. Service tariffs. Service tariffs are tricky. Because what they essentially do is put a value tariff, like, you know, if I sell you something with a 5% tariff, I have to take 5% of that value and give it to the government. What if you started doing the same thing to services? So when I do this in my own company, if I have some very kind of menial kind of spreadsheet work to be done, I will actually send it to India to get it done. So right before I'm done for the day, around 5 or 6 o'clock, I send it to this person in India, and I tell them I need this, this, and this done with this spreadsheet. They go to bed. When I get up in the morning, there it is. It's done. There's no physicality to what's done. They just manipulated the spreadsheet as I asked. There's no way for a government to track that. But some people are proposing service tariffs on that. So I paid that person some amount of money to do that task. And now the government wants to charge some sort of tariff on it, or some people are proposing it. The problem is, how do you track that? How do you get inside people's internet, computer, etc., to make that happen? How do you find out that these transactions are taking place and really track that? So it's a privacy concern for me, partially. What level of interference in my day-to-day activity would I have to deal with to allow them to charge some sort of service tariff? In 2005, Ford Motor Company paid $23 million in customs duties and fines for failing to report to the U.S. government the full value of engineering drawings it received from overseas contractors. Basically the same thing. They asked people in India or China, I don't remember which, to do these drawings. They were done in like a CAD system, you know, one of those engineering systems, emailed back to Ford, and the U.S. government got wind of it and said, you owe us a bunch of money because you sent these drawings over to India or China to be manipulated, and they got sent back and you need to pay. Again, I have a problem with that, because how would you track that? The tracking mechanism is wrought with problems as far as privacy goes. In 2001, the U.S. government started charging owners of U.S. registered ships a 50% duty on the importation of repairs done to their ships in foreign dry docks. So you own a giant container ship, it's registered in the U.S., you ship something to, I don't know, you ship something to Africa. While you're in Africa, you drop all the stuff off, and you realize, oh, I need the rudder repaired. And a guy spends a couple days and a few $1,000s repairing the rudder. And when you arrive back in the United States to pick up your next load, the customs service is there and they present you with a bill because you had some work done on your ship when you were gone. Again, we can argue about that one. I mean, you know, if you get a new radio put in your ship, or if you get a new engine, maybe, but just repairs, I don't know about that. I question the validity of that based upon, well, I questioned it based upon what we talked before about the ethical concerns, but I also questioned it about the interference with kind of your day-to-day activity. How do people find out this is done? What kind of reporting do you have to do? What's the bureaucracy required to make that kind of thing happen? So we continue to place directed penalties on certain countries and even certain companies for dumping their products in the United States. So if you sell your product in the United States for below what you charge for that same product in your own country, you're technically dumping, according to the U.S. government. So if I'm a Chinese company and I sell my product for $3 in China, but I sell it in the United States for $1, that's against the law. And the U.S. government is allowed to charge you a dumping charge. Basically put a special tariff on your specific product that you have to pay. That's problematic in and of itself. What's more insidious about it is that the U.S. government only finds out about this if somebody reports you. And what's happening now is that third-party countries and companies are starting to report other countries and companies to the U.S. government. Example, a Chinese company was supposedly dumping something in the United States. States, a Vietnamese government official ran to the US government and said, you got to stop these Chinese products from coming into the United States. Shocker, that Vietnamese official was also involved in a Vietnamese company that sells the exact same product. So we've created this huge lobbying mechanism that allows now U.S. congressional or U.S. Congress people to basically be lobbied by third-party countries, which I find that kind of insidious and problematic. It's just odd to me. But again, it's an infringement on trade. So there's also things going on. It's a similar thing with a war on shrimp. There's all kinds of Vietnamese, again, shrimp entering the U.S. It's making shrimp prices relatively low in the United States, but there are all kinds of shrimp fishermen in the Gulf Coast who are really angry about this. They're lobbying the congressman about it, trying to put some sort of duty on Vietnamese shrimp specifically. So I'm going to give you a couple cases here real quick that, oh, you know what, I forgot, I can't read the example that I did yesterday, but I can read something. So there was a case involving Estee Lauder, the makeup company. It's called Estee Lauder versus the United States. And here's what happened. Estee Lauder brought in a case, it looked like a suitcase, filled with makeup to the United States to sell. And Estee Lauder said that this is, makeup, so therefore it gets a 0% duty. There's nothing you have to pay on this when it enters the United States. The US government said, no. It may be a case full of makeup, but in fact, it is a suitcase. And therefore, there's a 20% duty on suitcases brought from overseas. There is a 20-page US federal government case with a judge and a jury and the whole thing about this case, arguing at great length, like I said, 20 pages, about whether this case of makeup is makeup or a suitcase. And it goes on to, I encourage you to look this up. Just type in Estee Lauder versus the United States into Google. You will find pages upon pages of arguments and paragraphs in this case that make pretty much no sense at all. It's just talking about, what is the nature of makeup and what is the nature of a suitcase and whether it's very kind of Bill Clinton, kind of what the nature of is arguments. And it just goes on for pages and pages and pages. It's absurd. There's an entire bureaucracy and there's an entire class of lawyers and an entire class of bureaucrats and judges that deal with this stuff on a daily basis. That's a problem for me. That's a problem because, on one level, I just don't want people getting paid to talk about whether this is makeup or a suitcase. That just seems silly to me. But also, it's an infringement. Why? The harmonized tariff code of the United States, and of all countries, because all countries have pretty much agreed on what it says, is thousands upon thousands of pages long. It just creates opportunity for anger and disagreement. And I find that problematic, and I don't think it's necessary. Here's just a couple more examples. Cell culture bioreactors. These are things that are used for biochemical reactions. They basically keep cultures a constant temperature for long periods of time. Well, problem is that there are two designations under the tariff code where this product could be put. One is machinery for the treatment of materials by a process involving a change in temperature, and the other is machines having individual functions not specified elsewhere. But unfortunately, involving a change in temperature is not what these things do. They actually keep a constant temperature over time. So you had pages upon pages of lawyerly argument about whether something that keeps a constant temperature should be classified under something that involves a changing of temperature. Again, pages upon pages of argument talking about this and what's right and proper under the tariff code. Two more examples, actually three. Zeroing. I talked a little bit about dumping before. So if you sell your product for less here than you do in your own country, you're dumping. There's a big long formula that figures out what the dumping duty should be on your products. I won't explain it to you because I don't understand it myself. But basically what it said, you take that, you take what they sell it for there, minus what they sell it for here, and that gives you some sort of positive number, and that tells you, how much the dumping duty should be. But what if you get a negative number there? Because in one instance or one example, they sell it for less there than they do here. Because you have to test it over time, and you have to test it from different companies. There's a whole regimen in how this is done. So what if you get a negative number? That would lower dumping duty that you would apply on that product, right? Well, the US government has decided arbitrarily that if you get a negative number in that formula, that it just disappears and then it becomes zero. It's called zeroing. If you type zeroing into Google, you'll find a Wikipedia page of it. And basically, it's an arbitrary decision by the US Department of Commerce that says, when something happens that we don't like, we pretend it didn't happen. That's essentially what they've said. If there's a negative number here, we don't like negative numbers, so it becomes a zero. Why? Because they said so. Because there's actually no law that says zeroing can happen. This is purely by administrative fiat. There's no law that says zeroing will exist. Congress never said zeroing is a thing. A U.S. Department of Commerce bureaucrat said zeroing is a thing, and it's just kind of grown from there. Can I wait till I get to the end for the questions? I'm almost done here. Actually, I'll go right to the example, and the final example, which is the title of this talk, the Action Heroes versus Dolls. In early 2000s, Marvel Comics was selling action figures, X-Men, Spider-Man, things like that, action figures about yay big. And they were shipping them from some country overseas into the United States. Marvel wanted them classified as other figures. Essentially, that was the designation. The U.S. government wanted them classified as dolls. Other figures has a 0% duty. Dolls have a 20% duty. It's a huge difference. It would make a huge impact on the bottom line for the shipment. 20% versus 0%. Under the law, dolls, in the harmonized tariff code, dolls are defined as things that look like humans, or that have human-like characteristics. And the US government said, well, Spider-Man, Wolverine, whoever, had 2 arms, 2 legs. That's a human-like figure. And Marvel had to argue that, but they're not humans. They're mutants, or they're superhuman. You have, type in, it's Toy Biz versus the United States. Toy, B-I-Z, versus the United States. Type it in. You will see, again, 20 to 30 pages of lawyer argument talking about what is the nature of humanity or humanness, and what is human versus superhuman, what is a mutant. You have quotes from comics in this case, basically when X-Men are basically arguing that, I am a human being and you can't treat me like this, things like that. It goes on and on and on about this stuff. And I know that's a little bit of a silly example, and it's somewhat amusing. It gets people's attention because it has to do with comics, and that's cool and all. But this goes on every day, and this goes on for products that are much more mundane than even makeup or comic books or action figures. These are essentially technical barriers to trade or non-tariff barriers, because there's no there is a tariff involved, but we've complicated the system so much. We've complicated the bureaucracy. We've complicated the tariff code in such a way that we can find ways to redefine any particular product into the category that gets the higher tariff. And if you look at this, that's exactly what the U.S. government tried does the government care whether something is a doll or an action figure? Well, 0% versus 20%. That's their only motivation. Otherwise, they shouldn't care. When you import something, most of the time you self-declare what your tariff is and what your designation is. You only get called on it if some customs official is going through the box, going through the container that just landed at the port and says, you know what, I'm going to argue this one. I'm going to send this up to my boss and say, I think we should challenge this one. Well, why do customs official care? Wouldn't it be great if you were a customs official and basically all you did was says yes, 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 and checked all these boxes and went home every day? But somebody's filling out a lot of paperwork because somebody's getting pressure to say, you know what, we need to make more money off of this. That's their only motivation. I can't think of any other way or reason why customs officials would challenge self-declarations of what your code is. Because they're getting pressure from somebody up top that says customs has to pull in, their budget number of income. And we're not going to make it this year, so let's turn that action figure into a doll. And that'll get us 20%. Hey, we made our budget. That seems logical to me. I can't think of another reason why they would do that. So we're arguing basically about how the government gets its money, and we're arguing about whether or not these trades can happen in a quick and efficient way. I think I'll leave it at that. But the takeaway I'd like you to take away from this talk is that really think about the ethical component of trade. Really think about, we read your Adam Smith as far as why we trade. It's not because we just want that stuff that the other guy has. It's because we trade because that's how we improve ourselves and we improve our general capacity for living. That's how we get richer. That's how we get wealthier. That's how we get more better stuff. That's how we get more comfortable. That's why all of you have, quite frankly, the leisure to sit in a classroom and to sit in college for 4 years, because you're not out in the fields breaking your back or hunting deer or college is a direct output of having the leisure time to do this type of thing. We're more educated because we can trade and we can be more efficient with what we do. Really think about that, because I think that's the kind of the lost message of trade. All right, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.